Hello, all. Good afternoon. My name is Mike Breedlove. I've been working in the criminal justice field for roughly 21 years, and I'd like to talk about a debate that's going on in our society today. It's about whether or not marijuana should continue to be criminalized, or whether or not the federal and state governments should look at decriminalizing marijuana to be used in its various forms. Now, imagine you're a 45-year-old truck driver, father of 7 children. You're walking down the street in New Orleans, Louisiana. You get stopped by police officers who then perform a pat search on you. They find a small amount of marijuana on you, take you to county, they book you in, discover you've had 2 previous convictions for nonviolent offenses. You go to court, and because of those first 2 nonviolent offenses, you're convicted, sentenced to 13 years in prison. 13 years that you're not allowed to provide for your family, and 13 years that you're away from your family. Now, sounds like a pretty harsh scenario, but that happened to a gentleman by the name of Bernard Noble in 2010. Now, one of the first things I would like to speak on is the cost of enforcing marijuana laws. Huffington Post article estimates that the U.S. spent roughly $3.6 billion in 2010 just for enforcing our current marijuana laws. In a New York Times article, they cite that the ACLU predicts that over the next 6 years, the United States will spend roughly $20 billion to do just the same. That's a lot of money. In a study conducted by the United States Department of Justice, they estimate that 12% of state and federal inmates are serving time for some type of marijuana-related offense. Having said all this, and knowing the vast amount of money that's being used to enforce marijuana laws, and how much money is being spent to incarcerate individuals, which the U.S. Department of Justice estimates to be $1 billion a year, it still has not deferred or deterred American individuals from partaking in marijuana. It's roughly estimated that 30 million people in the United States today regularly use marijuana in some form or fashion. A Huffington Post article also suggests that if marijuana was to be made legal in the United States, that the government would save upwards of $41.8 billion. And of course, that would be because of the savings of not having to patrol and enforce these laws, but also reaping tax benefits and regulating marijuana. One of a critical question that also exists is whether or not marijuana is a gateway drug, whether or not marijuana is dangerous. In a National Institute on Drug Abuse study, it is suggested that marijuana is deemed as a gateway drug because what it does is primes the brain for enhanced responses to other drugs or more harsh drugs like heroin or cocaine. Okay? The studies are divergent on whether or not marijuana is a gateway drug or whether or not it's even addictive. The same study that the National Institute on Drug Abuse cited that marijuana may be a gateway drug also suggests that alcohol and tobacco have the same effects. Specifically, they also prime the brain to have enhanced stimulation to harder drugs. And now, obviously, we all know that alcohol and tobacco are legal. A recent Newsweek article suggests that marijuana is not a gateway drug, that actually societal or sociological problems or issues help to exacerbate whether or not somebody's going to move on to harsher drugs. And that Newsweek article basically cited that poverty or poor social conditions are a large harbinger of whether or not somebody is going to move on to a higher or harsher drug. They also talked about association with people who are currently using harsh drugs or harder drugs. such as cocaine and heroin, how that could be influential in whether a person is going to go ahead and partake in those drugs, as well as mental illness and antisocial conditions. Lastly, they cite criminalization and prohibition of marijuana itself as a pretty good indicator that somebody will go on and partake in harder drugs, because once a person is convicted of marijuana violation, then they are stigmatized, and so they have nothing to lose because it's harder to get a job and whatnot. So that's one of the other areas that they hypothesize that somebody would partake in harsher drugs. As to whether or not it's dangerous, the same Newsweek, or excuse me, The Guardian cites that there are 2,331 deaths daily attributed to alcohol and tobacco, while there is no deaths attributed to marijuana. So there are, again, divergent schools of thought on whether or not marijuana is dangerous or whether it's even a gateway drug, which is one of the reasons why the DEA and the federal government have deemed it to be illegal. Lastly, we have to consider whether or not marijuana has any redeeming qualities. Specifically, does marijuana have any kind of medicinal value? In a Guardian publication, in news article, it was suggested that marijuana does in fact have medicinal value in treating multiple sclerosis and epilepsy. In one case, they cited a child in Colorado who was having upwards of 300 episodes of epileptic seizures per week, and after taking marijuana or medicinal marijuana in liquid form, was reduced down to 2 to 3 episodes per month. They also suggest that glaucoma the condition can be treated with marijuana, as it reduces tension in the eyes. HIV and AIDS patients use it to get their appetite back and to reduce nausea and vomiting. As well as it has redeeming qualities, according to this study, for arthritis, as it loosens the joints. So we've examined whether marijuana, as far as enforcement and the cost of enforcement and incarceration, we've looked at whether or not it's dangerous or a gateway drug, and we've also looked at or examined whether or not it's got any redeeming medicinal value. So moving forward, society has a lot to look at in determining whether or not they want to pursue decriminalization and allow for regulation by the governments to support marijuana use, or keep it criminalized. It's a very hot button topic, and it's very complex, and one that we're going to have to take a look at moving forward in our society. Thank you, and have a pleasant evening.